Good afternoon. And first, let me thank Sarah and SAGE and CASBS for this award, and just say it's truly an honor to be here with these distinguished scholars today and thinking about the challenges facing cities. My work has focused on cities for over 25 years, and I've been trying to understand what schools can do to influence the character of cities. And on the other side of that, how schools are in turn influenced by social economic conditions in the local environment. I got into this work almost accidentally. I was a graduate student at Berkeley and was asked by the mayor of Berkeley to become her chief of staff while still a graduate student, which I thought was a good thing for some reason. And Berkeley was in the midst of a major crime wave related to crack cocaine. It was also grappling with issues like homelessness and just depressed conditions in the south and west quadrants. And after about 3 months in the job, I'd realized I'd made a mistake because I was being blamed for all of those problems. And I started to be drawn back into education and realized that education was both implicated in all of those problems, that is the failure of education, but also potentially in some of the solutions. So I want to draw on that. What role could school reform play in thinking about some of the solutions to the problems facing the cities? And I want to start by just pointing out that schools have always played an important role in this country. They were the institution we turned to integrate new immigrants, and we still do. Even though without any guidance on how to do that, right? How to teach them English, for example, or how to help them on the pathway to citizenship. But whether they came from Western Europe or today, increasingly from Central and South America, it's our schools that are on the front lines of figuring out how to acculturate and to absorb immigrant populations. We also look to schools to help democratize the country, and I'm thinking about Ira Katznelson, who's here today, whose book, Schooling for All, really helps us understand the ways in which the advancements in public education really foreshadowed all of the other changes in civil rights, because we first bestowed rights on individuals through public education and then extended them elsewhere. And even when it took sending in troops, as it did in Little Rock, Arkansas, to dismantle what in effect was American apartheid, we looked to the schools to lead that effort. And so I would say that from a number of reasons, public education has been critical to American democracy historically, and I would say that role, though, is in real jeopardy right now. And the jeopardy is created by the fact that poverty and segregation and inequality are growing, and that in most cities, our public schools only serve the poorest segment of the population. Our public school systems, regardless almost of the character of the city, almost always comprise predominantly of the poorest children and disproportionately African American and Latino children in most of our cities. Right now, we have the highest or the second highest child poverty rates amongst advanced industrialized nations. And increasingly, we find schools overwhelmed by challenges that are simply related to poverty. I always think it's helpful to get a Nobel Prize-winning economist to reinforce the point that inequality is growing, but if you heard the last panel right here, that it's particularly growing in our cities and manifest in our cities. And because it's growing so widely, what we're seeing is that as poverty rates have risen, for example, under the last 12 years in New York City, poverty rates rose to almost 50% of the population now living at or below the poverty level. But we're seeing similar patterns in other cities across the country. We're also seeing high degree of neighborhood segregation on the basis of race and class in cities across America today, even as they're gentrifying. And that is producing a new dynamic. But the dynamic is not necessarily changing the inequities. This is just one reflection of the wealth gap in the country as it's manifest. And what's important about this, these patterns is that what we've known for the longest time is the strongest predictors for how well a child will do in school, for how well they'll do on the SAT, or for how well and what kind of college they'll go to, has always been family income. Family income, when combined with parental education, particularly the education of the mother, very strong predictor of how well a child will do in school. And so as we see these disparities widen, it becomes, I think, increasingly important to ask, well, what can schools do in such an inequitable society to lessen the degree of inequality and to hopefully influence patterns of opportunity? I would say right now we aren't doing nearly enough. And the simple fact is that across the country, we see a very distinct and clear pattern. That is, wherever poverty is concentrated, school failure tends to be the highest. Highest dropout rates, lowest test scores, highest teacher turnover, challenges with safety, and a number of other social issues that impact learning. And it also tends to be in this country, and we don't talk about it nearly enough, that we spend the least to educate the poorest children because we rely on property taxes primarily to fund education. And so we find ourselves in a situation where schools are grappling with issues that go well beyond educating children. I was talking to a group of principals in Michigan who described sending food home with children on Fridays because they knew that many of the children would not eat over the weekend, because the one place they're sure the children will eat and often get more than one meal is in public school. And so the real question is, can schools do this? Are they up to the challenge? So far, we've had a very interesting and I would say problematic debate about this issue, because we've had leaders, including Joel Klein, the former chancellor of New York City Public Schools, Janet Murguia from the National Council de la Raza, and Michael Lomax from the National Council, the Negro College Fund, who maintain poverty is not an issue, that really schools can do this. This is really about creating the right conditions in schools. And I had this debate numerous times with Joel Klein while he was chancellor of New York City, and also with the mayor, Mike Bloomberg, and his representatives. And we had data showing that where poverty was concentrated, school failure was always the highest. But there was no plan in New York City to even mitigate the effects of poverty. And as I'll show in a moment, that just contributed to a worsening set of conditions throughout New York City. This is a pattern, and those of you who know New York City will know some of these neighborhoods. It just shows you that these are both the poorest neighborhoods on the left, but with the lowest percentage of students who are graduating college ready, meaning that they have the test scores and completed the course sequence necessary for admission to one of the four-year schools in New York. And they are all overwhelmingly Black and Latino, right, as are the neighborhoods. And that pattern is not a New York pattern, that is an American pattern. And it's one that you see repeatedly in cities across the country. Of the 50 largest school systems in the country, all urban school systems, over 80% of the children qualify for free or reduced lunch. Over 80% of the children are African American Latino. Right? So we're in a situation of hyper-segregation in our schools. And if you read the work of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, they've been documenting this and calling attention to it. But in this year, the 60th anniversary of Brown decision, almost not a mention of this issue and what, if anything, should be done, with, given our history, seems quite odd, right? Given the fact that we, at least 60 years ago, thought that dismantling segregation was key to creating a more equitable society. So the question, I think, that's important to raise and to examine is, to what degree can schools, or conditions in schools, mitigate the effects of poverty? And if that were possible, what would have to happen for that to occur on a more extensive basis? And those are the issues I've been looking at through my own work and several others. And University of Chicago, the Consortium on School Improvement, carried out a 10-year study where they asked similar questions. They wanted to know how schools were affected by the reform policies that were launched in Chicago, which, incidentally, because Secretary Duncan was formerly the CEO of schools in Chicago, now are national policies in many cases. And what the research found is that there were 5 essential ingredients that had to be placed in schools for schools to have any chance of sustained improvement. And if you look at the list, they don't sound like anything that are all that surprising. You know, a coherent strategy for delivering instruction, ongoing development of the skills of the professional staff, a strong parent-community ties, a student-centered learning climate or culture, and leadership that can drive the change. And while those are not hardly surprising, what's interesting is they're not at all reflected in current policy. Right? If you look at Race for the Top makes no mention of ensuring that these elements are in place. They do say things like firing the principal if the school doesn't improve, or half the teachers, even though there's no plan of where they will get new teachers or a new principal. So there's a total disconnect between what we know from research, particularly about schools in high-poverty urban areas, and what we're actually doing in the name of policy. Just to present an interesting contrast, I'd like to show some comparisons between New York and Tulsa, of all places, a very red state and a very red city, but following a very different path. New York, under Mike Bloomberg, who held power for 12 years, used pressure as the primary accountability strategy, threats of closure in schools, and he closed over 160 schools during the time he was in office, used data to monitor achievement, to judge teachers and schools, shut down the failing schools, expand charter schools, which, as we know, is an issue that's come up in several cities across the country, treat parents as consumers. So if you don't like what you're getting, then go to another school through choice systems, rely heavily on a very punitive approach to discipline, theory being that if you can get rid of the bad kids, then there will be a safer environment for other children, and encourage competition among schools, the theory being that competing schools will be forced to improve, and the low performers will be shut down eventually. Tulsa, interestingly, has embarked on a totally different course. And I've been back working with Tulsa, and I really should make it Tulsa Union. It's a neighboring city. And there, they are one of the first cities in the country to have universal preschool, one of the first to have community school. Every school in Tulsa now is a community school with a full range of services, from after-school care to health services to social workers on site. And I kept asking, why Tulsa, why are you doing this? And I asked this of the mayor, the Republican mayor, and the Republican governor. They said, well, we've seen the research on the importance of early childhood education. I said, well, you need to share that research with other governors. And I said, well, we believe in it. And they're doing it through a partnership with a large foundation funded through an oil company, again, who cites the research on early childhood education. And the whole strategy is to mitigate the effects of poverty. That's the whole strategy. So they focus on using assessment to diagnose learning needs, not merely to measure and monitor students. They focus on the whole child, meaning there's arts, there's health, there's nutrition in the schools. They treat parents as partners, so parents and community organizations are in leadership roles at school sites. They use discipline to develop character, rather than merely to push children out with high needs, expand learning opportunities, and promote cooperation among schools. It's very interesting that Tulsa would be the contrast to New York. And I would say that New York does market-based reform better, it has done, than any other city. Right? At least graduation rates did rise under Mayor Bloomberg. There are not too many other cities that can say that. But at what cost? And the cost has been the concentration of the neediest children into the poorest schools. Now, the other thing about New York that's interesting is New York is also the home of the Harlem Children's Zone. And that's a model that's captured the nation's attention because Jeffrey Canada has developed a strategy to serve 6,000 children in Central Harlem through comprehensive services. Now, Jeffrey is quite capable, and he's been able to draw on the Goldman Sachs and the hedge funds to fund this, and he has an endowment of $170 million. So they have done quite a bit, and Mike Bloomberg, as the mayor, endorsed this, but did not decide to spread it to other communities in need. So while this work is going on in Harlem, it's not happening in East New York, it's not happening anywhere in the Bronx, although there's a similar effort now afoot in the South Bronx. But we do have examples that go beyond Tulsa, that if we take a more holistic approach, a more integrated approach to responding to the needs of schools, an approach that doesn't just focus on teaching and learning, but does keep that central, but also looks at issues like safety, nutrition, health, parent and community engagement, that we can get different results out of schools, even when poverty continues to be deeply entrenched and largely unabated. So I want to be clear, this is not a way to reduce poverty. This is a way, in fact, to help schools contend with poverty, which is a very important difference. This is a school in East Los Angeles, Harlem Middle School. And what's interesting about this classroom is it's a math class. It's a 90-minute math class. And as you can see, children are up out of their seats. And I like to point out that the teacher's so good, she can stand in the back and talk to me, because the children are in control of the learning that's going on. They're learning from each other. They're problem-sizing. They're so deeply immersed that even when the bell rings, they're disturbed because they are so busy doing the math. They're learning from each other. And what's important about this example is two things. One is this is the only classroom I saw like it in that school. So it wasn't being shared across school, the school, which is, I think, a real travesty. But the other thing that's important about it is it's happening in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Los Angeles, which is to say that you can deliver create high-quality learning experiences for kids even under these adverse conditions. Which is a point that I think is important to keep in mind, because increasingly what we're seeing, particularly with the advent of charter schools, is there's one model that's been endorsed as the model for educating poor children, what some call the no excuses model, right, which is a high degree of regimentation in the schools, and in challenging those who advocate, including Richard Whitmer, who wrote the book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. I point out to him there are many, many other schools that are succeeding with a different model, and it doesn't involve breaking the kids down and marching them in the hallways in silence. Here's one such school, PS 28 in New York City. We have very fancy names for our schools. This one is located in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where 40% of the children are homeless. Right? You would typically see in a school like this very high level of transience. You would expect to see very low test scores and all the other indicators we typically associate with failure, not at this school. This principal, featured in the Daily News, who got the highest gains in math and literacy, has constructed on her own a series of partnerships. A partnership with Downstate Medical School to bring in health care, another partnership with the YMCA to extend learning opportunities, another partnership with job training agencies so that parents are getting access to job training at the school site. Because of this work, this more integrated approach that she's taken, the school has created a learning environment where parents, even when they move, will take an additional bus or two to get their kids there because they know that they're getting a high-quality learning experience. Every classroom I visited at the school had 4 and 5 adults. When I visited, I said, where are you getting all these teachers from? She said, they're not all teachers, they're parents we train to assist teachers and work with children. When I visited, I was so impressed, I told her I was going to write to the Chancellor, Joe Klein, about what I'd seen, and he said, well, before you leave, I have to show you one more thing. And she explained to me that they are monitoring every single student at the school. There's a personalized learning plan for every student, which means that there's nothing left to chance. They know exactly which students are making progress, which students are not, which students, what level of support they need, and they have a plan in place to provide that support. And so when you see schools like these, or this one, and this one I find particularly gratifying, Brockton High School, because Brockton High School is the largest high school in the state of Massachusetts with over 4,000 students. Brockton is an old industrial town that has the only high school in the state of Massachusetts that receives a level 1 rating from the state. All the other level 1 rating schools are in very affluent suburbs. Brockton is not that. Brockton embarked on a very different path than most other schools when faced with the high-stakes exams. And many of us know that if Massachusetts were a nation, it would be among the top performers amongst nations, and their exams are some of the most rigorous in the country. They decided to do something different than most other school districts in Massachusetts that were faced with the prospect of large numbers of kids being denied diplomas. They decided that they were going to focus on literacy. They were going to make sure that every student got intensive support in literacy in the content areas. So they trained teachers. And when the principal at the time, Sue Satchwitz, explained how she was approached by a group of veteran teachers who said, we've got to focus on teaching these kids to read and write because their literacy levels are too low to do secondary school work. She said, I have no money to pay the teachers. She said, we'll do it for free, we'll do it on our own time, and we'll do it with the willing. And over the course of the next 10 years, and that's important to keep in mind because it took them 10 years, they are now, over 90% of their school meet the state standards. 1/3 of the senior class for 3 years in a row got the highest possible score on the state exams, which gives them a free scholarship to any public university in Massachusetts. Okay. 1/3 of that class is African American, 1/3 Latino, 1/3 low-income white. All the kids are low-income at Brockton. Now, I would think that if we have examples like these should become the basis for what we should be doing on a much, much larger scale. But sadly, that's not the case. Michael Fullen, a colleague from the University of Toronto, wrote an important paper comparing London and New York and Toronto and asked the question, why is Toronto getting better, particularly in serving high-poverty schools, whereas New York and London are not? And he points to the fact that in London, they use capacity building as the frame for addressing the needs of schools. The Ministry of Education comes in and asks, what does this school need? And then spends time figuring out how to provide the resources and training to teachers to address the needs, in contrast to New York and London, which has adopted a far more punitive approach to the schools and not seen nearly the same kind of results. I also point out, it's interesting, I gave a talk there and in Toronto recently, and someone pointed out, said, why do you think Canada has no ghettos? Right? And that's an interesting observation because, Windsor, Ontario is right across the river from Detroit and has a very large black population, but no ghettos. They have embarked, the strategy in Canada is just different, not just in terms of education, but in terms of everything else. And it shows in all of the quality of life indicators and academic performance for the students. Canada has always been one of the top performers in the world in terms of academic performance. We don't learn much from our neighbor to the north, and it shows. So what I want you to consider is whether or not we can, as social scientists, begin to try to influence the direction of policy. I came to the conclusion a while ago that it takes more than a good research paper to influence Congress or even the City Council for that matter. And I think that we have to consider other ways to begin to influence both the discourse but also what is considered as possible with respect to school reform. We spend billions of dollars each year in the name of reform. And as my colleague at University of Chicago, Charles Payne, writes, so much reform, why so little change? And I would say it's because for the most part, we're not focused on the right things. We're not focused on the learning conditions within schools. We're not focused on helping schools to address and manage the effects of poverty in the neighborhood. And we're not focused on engaging the educators who actually do the work, because we do a reform to them, not with them. And I could go on of what else is wrong with the picture, but the cost of failure is great. I was struck by the fact that in some of the other panels I heard today, particularly in the panel on sustainability, we're talking about the social infrastructure of cities and how important that's going to be to developing sustainable cities in the future. Schools are a critical part of the social infrastructure of cities. And allowing the schools to continue to be as non-functional as they are. Right now in Philadelphia, we literally had children die this year because school nurses were laid off and there was no means to provide care to children. This is it would be, I think, a mistake to call it a crisis, because if it were truly a crisis, we'd see an urgent response. This is a truly chronic problem that it really does threaten the whole future of the country. And what I want you to consider is the fact that we have signs of possibilities that could point us in the direction of a different approach, an approach that could, I think, yield much, much better answers than we've seen so far. So it's with the hope of getting others to embrace that challenge of finding ways to change the conversation and change the outcomes that I thank you for the time this afternoon and open it up for your questions.